A very warm welcome to this Lockdown LitFest event. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Peter James, UK's #1 best-selling author, no fewer than 15 Sunday Times #1 bestsellers under his belt. He has sold over 20 million copies of his works. They've been translated into 37 languages. And as we're going to find out, he once, and probably still does, write poetry. Peter James, a very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest.
Thank you, Paul. Good to be on.
Well, I'm delighted to have you on board. You know what a fan I am of yours, and I'm aware of so many fans around the world who are absolutely captivated by what you write. We have to start somewhere, and I choose to start with this. When did you first come up with Roy Grace, Detective Superintendent Roy Grace, and how has your relationship changed with him over the period of time you've been writing about him?
Well, it all came about, oddly enough, when I got burgled. Way back in 1982, I just had my first book published, a not very good spy thriller called Dead Letter Drop. And I got burgled, and a young detective came to take fingerprints, and he saw the book, and he said, "Oh, if you ever want research help with the police, give me a call." And he was married to a detective also. His name was Mike Harris. And my then wife and I became friendly with them, and they invited us to a barbecue one day at their house, and about a dozen of their friends, and they were all cops, everything: response, traffic, homicide, child protection team. And talking to these guys and women, I suddenly realized that there is nobody sees more of human life in a 30-year career than a police officer. You know, in a single day, they can go from a terrible tragedy like a cop death, having to deal with that, to a horrible domestic abuse, to a couple swindled out of their life savings, to a traffic fatality, to a murder. Anything can happen. And they get that sort of privileged look behind the curtain that I don't think any other profession, not even journalists, get as much as the police officers do. And when they realized I was genuinely interested, over the next few years, I started making more and more friends within the police, and they grew comfortable with me. They'd start inviting me out on patrol, sit in a patrol car. It got to the point where they'd call me and say, "We're going to an interesting crime scene. Would you like to come and see it?" And I started putting police characters more and more into my books. I was then writing kind of more psychological thrillers. And in 1997, somebody said to me, "Oh, you might like to meet this guy, Dave Gaylor. He's a young DI in Brighton." And I remember going to his office, and we just kind of clicked. And he, at that time, was working on cold cases, but he was also an active senior investigating officer on homicide. Mm-hmm. And he said, "What are you writing at the moment?" And I was writing a thriller called Denial. And he said, "Tell me about it." So I started telling him. He said, hang on a sec, I don't think your character has done that. And why have you not got an outside inquiry team doing this? And do you think she'd have thought that way? And I thought, wow, this guy has a really big mental bandwidth. And we became friends, and he helped me on the next 3 books that I wrote. And during that time, he rose up through the ranks and became, in 2002, Detective Chief Superintendent, Head of Major Crime for Sussex. And it was around that time that my publishers, Macmillan, asked me if I'd ever thought of creating a detective as a central character. So I went to Dave Gaylor and I said, "How would you like to be a fictional cop?" And he loved the idea. And what it is about him, and it's something I've noticed about all really good true life detectives, is that there tends to be an image of them that we get very much from kind of television series, where they tend to be sort of angry, bolshy, grumpy people. But in fact, the really good homicide detectives are not that at all. They are very calm people, and they have 2 completely opposing character traits, which I think is what makes them unique and so good at their job, which is, on the one hand, they are completely anal, because any major crime is hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny pieces painstakingly put together. And yet, so often crimes are solved with sheer blue sky thinking, creative thinking. And Dave had those 2 qualities. And he and I kind of worked on the first Roy Grace novel, Dead Simple, and he was helping me get the authenticity of the policing right. And our relationship just grew really from there. And we've worked together with him kind of in the background on every Roy Grace novel, getting every detail I possibly can in the policing right. And over the years, we've become best mates. When Lara and I got married in 2015, Dave was best man. We travel a lot together. We go to homicide conferences once a year in America. I always joke that some people travel with their private detective. I travel with my private detective chief superintendent.
And so long-term relationships like that require an enormous amount of trust. I'm really impressed to hear your show because, of course, he trusted you. What do you think it was that he saw in you that allowed him to trust you? And I know from policemen friends of mine that it takes a while for that to happen because they're privy to such extraordinary, humanity in extremis. And often it's a closed shop when they're talking about it. So for him to sort of break ranks in a way is a big move, I'd have thought.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And I've often heard the police, both in the UK and when I've been in the States and in other countries, refer to us and civilians.
Yeah.
They regard themselves, and you would understand this from your own military background, very much as a sealed unit. And they're deeply mistrustful of outsiders, especially writers. I can give an example of that. I was on research, and I'd gone to Melbourne in Australia for some key scenes in one of my earlier Roy Grace novels, Dead Man's Footsteps. And I needed to meet with Australian detectives. And I had an introduction to these two guys, and one was quite cheerful. The other was a guy called Troy Berg, and he was so taciturn, and I was sitting in the back of their car, and I was literally getting monosyllabic answers to every question, and he clearly didn't like writers. And I was thinking, I've got to break through with this guy somehow. So I said to him, Troy, what do you do to switch off at weekends? He turned around and said, I'll play the banjo. I just cracked up, and he did too, and we ended up becoming really good mates and getting completely pissed that day.
Fantastic. Of course, the definition of a gentleman, someone who can play the banjo but chooses not to.
I love that.
Now, the first outing for Roy Grace was, of course, Dead Simple, which is a huge hit. I'm kind of intrigued to sort of walk you through a little bit, or get a little bit of insight into the trajectory of your writing career. What was it you were setting out to do with Dead Simple? And what have you've learned so much, of course, because the latest one that I've read, which is Dead at First Sight, which we'll talk about in a minute, is such a fantastic piece of work. But when you were setting out to write Dead Simple, the question I suppose is, what did you think the nuts and bolts of a good detective thriller are? And which of the rules did you adhere to? And which of those rules did you think, actually, I'm going to play with these and make it my own?
I think that's a great question, Paul. And the reason I say it's such a good question, because what you're talking about is, for me, what defines really compelling thriller writing.
Yeah.
And my big, I guess, my kind of light bulb moment, the big moment in my life was when I read Graham Greene's Brighton Rock for the first time, age 14. And up until that point, I'd always loved crime novels. I loved Agatha Christie. I loved, in particular, the Conan Doyle novels and stories. But there was a tradition with English crime writing, and very much so apparent in the Golden Age, where a crime novel started with a dead body in the first page, certainly the first chapter, and the rest of the book was a puzzle to solve the crime. When Graham Greene wrote Brighton Rock, he completely threw away the rule book. It's got one of the best opening lines and the whole canon of literature, which is, within 3 hours of arriving in Brighton, Hale knew they meant to murder him. Who is Hale? Why is he in Brighton? Who's going to murder him? And Hale was still alive at the end of chapter 1. And I thought, that makes a much more exciting story. Because if you've got somebody alive but desperately in peril at the end of chapter 1, then you've got the reader gripped. And so with Dead Simple, I'd always been claustrophobic. I remember reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Premature Burial, and it gave me nightmares as a kid. You know, I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking I was buried alive. And so, you know, I started Dead Simple with the premise of a bunch of guys on a stag night, and they're going to get their revenge on their friend Michael, who's always played terrible pranks on them when they got married. And their idea is they've already dug a grave out in remote woods in the countryside. They're going to get him drunk, take him out there, put him in a coffin in this makeshift grave, cover it up. They're going to leave him with a walkie-talkie and a bottle of whiskey, and they're going to cover it up, and they're going to come back in 2 hours' time, dig him up. So they do this, they leave him in there, cover him up, drive off, and they all get wiped out in the car crash. And that's the end of chapter 1.
Wow. Do you know, that so appeals to me on 2 levels. One, of course, is the old Hitchcock definition of the difference between shock and suspense. You know, shock is 2 people sitting having dinner across a table and a bomb goes off. But suspense is 2 people sitting at dinner and you show the bomb under the table and cut between the bomb and the people having dinner. You know something they don't know. And you do that so well in your books. You set up, we see the bomb. It's amazing. Where can
I love that. I didn't know that. I'm going to use that.
Well, by all means, no, please, I gift it to you. I mean, I'm merely being a vector for Hitchcockian theory, but there we go. When did you last read Dead Simple? Do you reread your works after they've been published? Do you ever go back and think, oh, what did I have there? Are there seeds of anything in there that I can use going forward?
Not so much that, but I have recently reread it because Roy Grace is about to start production with ITV, with John Sim playing Roy, and so we've had the script of Dead Simple, which has been written by Russell Lewis, who writes all the Endeavour. So I had to go back to the book and just kind of make comparisons and see what's been included and what's not. But I do very rarely read one of my books once I finish, which may sound strange, but I get annoyed at myself. I'll start reading. I think, oh, why have I used that adjective 3 times on that page? Or surely I could have described that more originally. Yeah. So I tend not to go back that often.
As hard as it is.
Of course, and I have had to read several of the stage plays as well.
Right. While we're on the TV, thank you for foreshadowing that. What process is that at? When can we look forward to seeing it? And are you writing the screenplays?
No, I'm not writing the screenplays because I like to create kind of something completely new with my books all the time. So that ITV should have started shooting on April 20th with John Sim playing Roy Grace, and they had a great cast all together, and directed by John Alexander. And we're blessed with Russell Lewis writing the scripts. I think he's a wonderful writer.
Isn't he just?
Yeah, but unfortunately, because of COVID, all production has been shut down, both here and abroad. And at the moment, the plan is they're going to start shooting in early September. They want to shoot in Brighton in August because it's a holiday season. Right. So going to production in September, and we'll see. They're doing the first 2 books, September, October, back to back. Right. And we'll see them about this time next year, quite possibly Easter Sunday next year.
Well, fingers crossed for that. You mentioned Brighton, of course, and for those that aren't familiar with your works, if there is anybody out there that isn't, of course, Brighton is as much of a character in your books as the human characters that you describe. That's a big decision for any writer to take, to have a very keen sense of place. It's an important part of any plotting and of any background. But of course, you lived in Brighton. You had a responsibility to that place. How did that relationship work?
Well, I'm lucky. I mean, firstly, just on the first part of your question about place, I think place is incredibly important because places define the nature of the crime, the nature of the character. I think Morse's Oxford is a very different place to Ian Rankin's Edinburgh. And Brighton is a fascinating place because I've always said if you were a villain and you wanted to design your perfect criminal environment, you'd design Brighton. It's got everything a villain wants, which is it's got a major seaport on both sides, New Haven and Shoreham. It's got a small airport with no customs or immigration. It's got what it used to have the largest number of antique shops in the UK, wonderful for fencing stolen goods. Yeah. It's got a huge injecting drug market, very tragically. And it's a massive party town. It's got 2 universities. It's a huge stag and hen night place, a big party town. So it's a massive recreational drugs market. People congregate there. They sort of move down the country and they end up at Brighton and there's no further place to go. The drug dealers have got an endless supply of new people to push their drugs out on the streets. And it's a very beautiful place. I mean, 3 chief constables have told me that Brighton is the favorite place to live in the UK for first divisional criminals. So from a crime writing standpoint, I couldn't have picked a perfect place to be born in.
You know my next question, Vida, don't you? Given you've told us about your close relationship with the law enforcement side of things, how does it go on the other side of that equation and your relationship with them?
In terms of,
sorry, do you as an author, you seek counsel from major first divisional criminals as much as you do with major first division crime enforcement people?
Yeah, I mean, I talk to villains often, and obviously I find them fascinating. I do a lot of talks in prisons, partly for my kind of work for the reading agency, trying to encourage literacy. Because I think the terrible tragedy is that the average reading age in the UK prisons for 50% of the inmates is below 11 years old. But the other thing that I get out of that is meeting and chatting to criminals afterwards. You know, I had the wonderful character that I used in Love You Dead, this Black Widow character, and that came directly out of doing a talk in a women's prison about 9 years ago. And there was this woman sitting in the audience, and she was clearly a cut above the average prison inmate in terms of intelligence and being well read. She was asking very bright questions about literature. She was asking about Thackeray and Hemingway. And I wondered to myself, I thought, I wonder what you're in for. And I thought I must speak to her before I leave. So the big bang for me is to get to mingle with them afterwards. So I made a beeline straight for her. And I never say, what have you done? It's sort of not etiquette. Right. So I said to her, you know, what brought you in there? She was about 55, you know, quite nicely dressed, very well spoken. I said, you know, what brought you in here? She said, well, I poisoned my mother-in-law, the old bag. I go, okay. And she said, I got 9.5 more years to go, and it's just not fair. There's a woman in London done exactly what I've done. She's only got 6 more years. I said, okay. She said, well, the thing was, she went into hospital to die. So I embezzled her bank account, and the bloody woman didn't die. Came back home. I realized she'd find out what I'd done, so I had to poison her. Then I realized my husband would find out, so I had to poison him too. And it's just not fair, the length of my sentence.
Good heavens.
And I was being taken out. I said to the officer, I said, is that woman for real? He said, oh, yes, sir. Her husband was 3 months on life support. He's got permanent brain damage, and she's just angry about the length of her sentence. And I thought, you have to be a character in a future book.
That's just gold, isn't it?
And another character that I met, a guy called Ray Tully, who actually approached me in Brighton because he'd originally been tutored by Reggie Cray in Parkhurst when he was like 19, and he'd been a career bank robber all his life, and now wanted to write a book to try to encourage people not to go into a life of crime. And I met with this guy. I have a favorite restaurant in Brighton for meeting villains, which is Englishes. It's really old-fashioned. It's old Brighton. It's just the perfect setting. So I had lunch with him there. He's like, at that time he was 58 years old. It was about 5 years ago. And I said, you know, what was the biggest amount of money you ever got? He said, oh, I got 50 grand in a bank job about 18 years ago. And I said, what did you do with the money? He said, oh, rented a suite at the Metropole for 6 months, large it.
Good Lord.
And I said, you're 58 now. I said, you spent more time in prison. You're 58, you're broke, you're living in a bedsit in Brighton. You've got about 4 different children by 4 different mothers that you haven't seen for maybe 15, 20 years. And you spent more of your life in prison than out. I said, if you had to live your life over again, what would you do different? He said, oh, nothing. It's the adrenaline.
Really? Really?
You do get these kind of, I find these insights into the criminal mind fascinating.
It is extraordinary. The last one I read of yours, in fact, the last time we spoke, you just published a book, I think it was towards the end of last year, called Dead at First Sight, which had in its pretext a really good setup, which is about sort of online dating and scamming. Can you talk us through that a bit, and then you can bring me up to date with things that you published since. But I particularly enjoyed that book. Can we discuss that a little?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, very much. The genesis for that book was Sussex Police approached me saying that residents of Sussex had been scammed out of £30 million in the previous 2 years through online dating scams. And they asked if I'd be interested to write a novel in which I could highlight this very new and fast-growing crime. And they offered, obviously, to show me files, obviously without names, everything in confidence, but they would give me help. And this was in about February 2017, and I just left the meeting. And the following Sunday, in the Sunday Times, was a full-page article on this guy called Steve Buston, who was a motivational speaker in Brighton, saying his identity had been on different dating sites. And I had met him a few times. He interviewed me once on a Chamber of Commerce event. So I contacted him, we met up for a coffee, and I said, what happened? He said, well, the first I knew about it was I got a phone call out of the blue from a woman in Somerset, Constance Wood. She's happy for us to use her name. She was a widow and antique dealer, and she said to me, she said, hi, Mr. Buston, you don't know me, but I thought I knew you. And her husband had died, and she'd gone onto one of the internet dating sites, and up had popped Steve Buston's face. And the guy gave his name as Michael Peterson. He was Norwegian. He worked in the petrochemical industry, currently out in Bahrain. And they got on really well, and she thought he was absolutely charming. And 2 weeks went by, and he said, I'm coming to England next week. I would love to meet you. And she had already told him that she was actually going off to Australia the following Monday. And he obviously remembered this. And she said, I'm off to Australia on Monday. Oh, Constance, please don't go. I must meet you. And she said, well, I've already paid for my ticket and everything else. I'm going to see my grandchildren, and I'm going to be there 3 months. Oh, Constance, I tell you what, I'll pay for your ticket, buy you a new ticket if you stay. He was never going to do that. But, she immediately thinks, oh, nice guy, he cares. Anyway, she goes to Australia. They carry on for 6 months. And then she gets the inevitable text, which goes something like, Constance, my sister's just been diagnosed with ovarian cancer. We've got to get her into a private clinic urgently to beat the queue here. I'm divorcing, was frozen the bank account. Could you lend me 25,000 euros? I'll pay you back as soon as we sell the house. Constance, unlike a lot of people, was savvy enough to be suspicious. And she did a Google reverse search. So she put his image into Google, and up he popped with 10 different hairstyles, 10 different names on 10 different dating sites.
Good Lord.
So she challenged him and said, I don't think you're who you say you are. He said, oh, Constance, some bastard has stolen my identity on the internet. And they're using me to scam people. I can prove it's the real me. He said, let's have a Skype conversation. So she said, okay. So they set up a Skype for a couple of days' time. And the Skype goes something like this. Hi, Constance, back section area. And it kept breaking up and stopping. And what the scammers had done was they had taken one of Steve Buston's motivational speeches off YouTube and lip-synced answers to any question they figured he might get asked.
Wow.
And Constance sent me this Skype, and I showed it to Laura, my wife, and Laura said, I would have been taken in by this. And that's what, Dead at First Sight is basically about the world of internet scammers. And I did a huge amount of research into it, and I was very lucky to meet a private detective who runs an agency, a guy called Jack Roberts, who'd been specializing in this. And the epicenter of it is Ghana, where you or I, Paul, could go to Ghana, enroll in one of 11 different schools for internet scammers in the capital. And their attitude is, oh, well, the West have been screwing Africa for 500 years. It's our turn now.
Good heavens. Good heavens.
There's one guy, age 19, who's got 11 brand new Range Rovers, and they are making millions and millions and millions out of mainly kind of middle-aged to elderly people looking for love again in their lives.
What they're making is that they're making it out of human sadness and hope. That's the tragedy of it.
It's horrible.
How appalling. What sort of response did you have to the book? I like the fact that it had its inception, its catalyst, as a request from the police force to try and highlight this crime. Has there been any effect subsequent to publication?
Yeah, and I've had a hugely good reaction to it. It's probably been the best-selling Roy Grace novel for several years. I mean, luckily their sales have been going up, but the sales of Dead at First Sight really took a leap up. I think it touches a lot of nerves in people. I think everybody these days knows somebody who's been looking for a new relationship, a new partner with a dating agency. And I know a lot of people who've been hugely successful. Instead of several police officer friends of mine have met a fabulous partner. But equally, there are an awful lot of people who've been horribly conned. I mean, one guy I met in his kind of late 50s, worked in the health service. He's from Northern Ireland, and he told me he met this lady online who told him she was the widow of a soldier who'd been killed in Afghanistan, and just before he died, he found a cave full of treasure, and he got a bent customs officer, and if they could bung him 25 grand, he'd turn a blind eye and get these treasures, which they reckon was probably worth 100 million or more, out of the country.
Wow.
So this guy took a suitcase, £25,000 in it, to a hotel in Bilbao and handed it over to this big tall dude in the foyer. Gets home 2 days later, the dude phones him and says, oh man, that went really well, but the customs officer's friends now found out about it, so we're going to have to pay him 25 grand too. So back this guy goes to another hotel in Spain with another 25 grand in a suitcase. And by the time I spoke to him, he was £180,000 in the hole.
Oh my word.
And I said, you're a wealthy guy? He said, no, he said, it's my life savings. He said, I've had to remortgage the house. It's every penny I've got. I said, didn't you ever think at any point you were being scammed? He said, yes, it sort of becomes like a gambler's folly. He said, you think, well, I know it's wrong, but if I just keep going, maybe it'll come right.
Just awful. What have you been writing since? What have you been writing? What have you released since Dead Simple? I know that we're about 6 months out of date. Not Dead Simple. Dead at First Sight. Bring us up to date in the herb of Peter James.
I've got the Secret of Cold Hill, which is the follow-up to the House on Cold Hill ghost story, in which the big old mansion's been burnt down. And there's now a housing estate with 130 swanky brand new homes built on this haunted ground. And the first two couples have moved in, and that's been a lot of fun.
Actually, I remember reading that. That is can I recommend that? Can I recommend that to you? Secret of Cold Hill. It's a stunningly good read and a slightly different tone for Peter. So if you're used to the Roy Grace, you can get to see a bit of breadth and depth of his writerly brain. Sorry, Peter.
Thank you. It's coming out in paperback on about June the 25th, 26th. And then I've got the new stage play, the Looking Good Dead. That's going to launch on a nationwide tour in January, God willing, with all that's going on with the pandemic. But that's scheduled to start on national tour January the 27th.
Good luck with
And
that.
I've got New Roy Grace, Find Them Dead,
Really?
which should have been coming out May the 14th. It's now coming out July the 9th. And that is, it's another Roy Grace. And I'm really excited about it.
What's it called, Peter? What's it called?
It's called Find Them Dead.
Nice.
And it's basically the basic premise. It's a mother. She's 42. 5 years ago, her family were in a terrible car crash coming back from holiday. Her husband and teenage son were killed, and her teenage daughter survived. And that daughter is everything she has in her life now. And the daughter's on a gap year, and she's gone off backpacking with her best friend to South America. And mother gets summoned onto jury service. Her name's Meg, and she gets onto the trial of a major Brighton county lines drug baron. But the third day of the trial, she goes home, and there on her kitchen table is a photograph of her daughter in Ecuador. And she's thinking, where on earth did that come from? Then her phone rings, and the voice says, "We know where your daughter's going to be every single day, every single hour. If you ever want to see her again, alive." At the end of the trial, the jury has to say 2 words, and you know what they are.
That's a damn good setup. Peter, I've just realized you're in your writing room. Yes?
Yes.
Do you have a copy of Find Them Dead to hand?
No, the copies actually haven't come in yet, which is really infuriating.
I was going to cheekily ask you to read the first paragraph.
Well, I can do that on my laptop.
Would you mind very much?
No, I just have to turn my...
Would you mind giving the Lockdown LitFest audience a sneak preview of your new book, Find Them Dead? I'd be delighted if you could do that.
Yeah, it may take me a second to find it.
We'll wait. While we're waiting for Peter, we'll build the suspense. And I will get round to the question in a minute about why Peter won a poetry prize many, many years ago. And I'm dying to find out whether he still writes poetry in his spare time. And you will, of course, realize that the studio you see behind me here is a fiction of all our imaginations, created by some very cunning people with some very cunning algorithms. I think Peter won't mind me telling you that he's actually in the top of a tower where he does his writing from, which is a vast expanse of maple and wood with a view out across an island in the Channel Islands and across towards France. So the fantastic echo that you're hearing, that makes it sound like he's in the Lockdown LitFest studio. The acoustics are kindly provided by Peter by having such a huge writing space. He gave us a little tour earlier on, and I think we're probably going to do at some stage in the future an In the Writer's Room. If you'd like that, keep us posted if you'd like to, because I'd like to start with Peter's writing room. He's got more collections of police cars and police memorabilia than I've seen in many a crime museum. Peter, you're waving at me. Does that mean you've got a paragraph for us?
Yeah, okay.
Chapter 1. Please give it up for Peter James, reading the first paragraph for his soon-to-be forthcoming novel, Find Them Dead. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter James.
It's Monday, November the 26th, 2018. Mickey Starr stared into the darkness, feeling restless and apprehensive and afraid. It wasn't fear of the darkness, but of what lay beyond it. Going to be fine, he tried to reassure himself. He'd done these channel crossings before without a hitch, so why would this one be any different? But it was. No escaping the fact. This was different. Fear was something that had never troubled him before, but throughout this trip, he'd been feeling a growing anxiety, and now as the shore grew closer, he was truly frightened, terrified if it all went pear-shaped. What would happen to the one person in his life who had ever really meant anything to him and who loved him unconditionally, whatever bad things he may have done? Wrapped up against the elements in a heavy coat and a beanie, roll-up smouldering in his cupped hand, the muscular, grizzled 43-year-old stood on the heaving front deck of a car ferry, braced against a stanchion to keep his balance. In prison, some 18 years back, his cellmate, an Irishman with a wry sense of humour, had given him the name Lucky Starr. Mickey should feel lucky, he told him, because he had a spare testicle after losing one to cancer in his teens, a spare eye after a detached retina in one that had put an end to his boxing career, and a spare arm for the one he'd subsequently lost in a motorbike accident. It was 4 a.m. and he was fighting off seasickness. He wasn't feeling particularly lucky at this moment out here in the middle of the English Channel in this storm. He had a bad feeling that maybe he'd used up all his luck. Maybe he should have found someone else to come with him after his colleague pulled out at the last minute due to sickness. He always felt less vulnerable and less conspicuous when he had a female companion with him. Maybe the Range Rover he was driving was too shouty. Put it out of your mind, Nicky. Get on with the job. The sea was as dark as extinction. The salty spray stung as he squinted through the bitter wind and driving rain. His confidence in tatters. He was wondering if he was making the most stupid mistake of his life.
Fantastic, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. Did you use the line in that, as dark as extinction?
Yes.
I like that. I like that. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Peter James reading an extract from his soon-to-be forthcoming novel, Find Them Dead. Who's it published by?
Macmillan.
Macmillan, fantastic. Come back to poetry, just so that we've got a couple of minutes left. You won a poetry prize at Charterhouse in 1960-something or other?
Yeah, I think it was about 1965, the Charterhouse Poetry Prize. And I've always loved poetry. And oddly enough, that poetry prize gave me my first writing break in life, because I went to film school after Charterhouse, and I got a job after film school working on a television show in Canada. It was a daily program for preschool children. And I'd been there about 3 months. I was the lowest human life form on a television set, and I was a gopher, literally, running errands, go for this, go for that. And the producer came in a blind panic one day and said, "The writer's sick, we don't have a show today. I just read your CV, you won your school poetry prize. Could you write today's show?"
Wow.
They sat me in a corner with an IBM golf ball Selectric, and they liked what I wrote, and I ended up writing that 3 days a week for the next year and a half.
Good gig.
But I love, I don't like to read fiction when I'm in the middle of writing a novel, because it's so easy to get influenced by somebody's style. So I always keep poems by my bed and read a couple at night.
I'm delighted to hear that. One last question for me, really. You've won so many awards, I'm not going to go through them, honorary doctorates, all sorts of stuff. I know how much work you put into your writing, Peter. I know anybody who is successful, commercially successful as a writer, it's hard work. I know, people like our mutual friend Anthony Horowitz has written sort of 8 hours a day, 7 days a week since he was 18. I know you're pretty much the same. When you get the awards, sales are one thing, I understand that. Readers, of course, one adores one's readers. They're the lifeblood. But what do the awards and the accolades mean to you? Do they mean something? Do they touch you?
Yeah, they mean a huge amount. And for a long time in my writing career, I didn't seem to get nominated for anything. Then I kept getting nominated and losing. And I thought, no, how do you actually kind of win an award? And I remember one time when, and we're dear friends, Ian Rankin and I, but I remember one time at the British Book Awards about 12 years ago, and he won for about the third year running, and I was shortlisted, and I remember saying, "Oh, fuck." And it was caught on camera, and about 4 million people saw it. And then Lee Child did exactly the same thing about a year later when he didn't win an award. And I said to him, I did just that last year. He said, well, if I'm up for an award, I bloody expect to win it. But what it's, on a serious note, and I think all awards are wonderful to have. It's great when you have an award that's judged by other writers, that's judged by your peers. And I think probably the two proudest awards that I've had for writing have been, I guess, firstly the Crime Writers Diamond Dagger Award, the Lifetime Achievement. It's always scary getting a lifetime achievement. You think, does that mean they think I'm going to die soon? And the other was That means a huge amount, this one. It was W.H. Smith had a public vote for the greatest crime writer of all time. And I was beyond gobsmacked to win that.
Yeah, I know. That's why I love chatting to you. I know it means so much to you, and we love what you write, and we love what you write. Peter James, thank you so much for joining us here at the Lockdown LitFest. Thank you for being so kind. I will accept your kind invitation to scooch around your writing room at some stage in the future once we're got a little bit more grass under our feet. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter James, appearing exclusively here on the Lockdown LitFest, specifically for you. There is going to be a buy his book button beneath this very screen shortly. All writers deserve sales. As you know, we're trying to support our authors, perhaps a little less fortunate than Peter, by paying them for their contributions here. So if you would like to make friends with our donate button, we'd be enormously grateful. From Peter James and from me, can I just say, please be safe. Keep well. Peter, would you like to say anything to anybody?
I would just like to say it's thrilled to be on this. It's a great initiative, this virtual festival. But I would just like to say to everyone at this tough time that do please try to stay safe and to take care of people, especially, I know from direct experience, my mother-in-law's on her own, totally isolated, not able to see her kids. It means a huge amount when we speak to her. We try to speak to her every day. I think if you know anyone who is alone, call them. It makes a world of difference to them. And let's hope we all get through this soon and that we can actually meet up in person again on the far side.
Amen to that. Peter, it's been lovely to talk to you. You warm my heart every time I do. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, thank you for joining us. Keep safe, keep well. And from all of us at Lockdown LitFest, be careful and thank you for joining us. Cheerio.